My name is Robin Tasaka, and I'm an English instructor at Maui College. This presentation focuses on avoiding plagiarism. We'll talk about what plagiarism is, why students do it, how teachers know, and how to avoid it. I hope that this presentation will help you to avoid problems with plagiarism in the future. So let's start off by making sure we're all on the same page as far as what plagiarism is. Plagiarism is using someone else's words or ideas without giving them credit. There are two things I want to emphasize in this definition. The first is that it talks about both words and ideas. Most of us know that if we use someone else's words, it's considered plagiarism. But as you can see in this definition, even if you're using your own words, if you're using someone else's ideas, you still need to give them credit. Plagiarism is essentially stealing. You won't get carted off by the police, but you can face serious consequences in the classroom. And that takes us to the second part, giving them credit. It's not that you can't use other people's words or ideas, you just need to give credit when you're doing this. You might be expected to give credit in different ways in different classes, so it's best to check with your instructor on his or her expectations. First though, how do teachers know when students are plagiarizing? Well, one way is that your paper doesn't sound like other writing you've submitted, other writing you've done for the class. It could also be that it just doesn't sound like student writing.
Long.
If there's a big shift in the paper, that tells us that you lifted part of it from another source. And some instructors also use plagiarism detection software. But even those who don't usually have their own methods similar to what that kind of software does. The reason I'm telling you these things is not so you can figure out a way around them, but because I want to convince you that if you plagiarize, you will get caught. Maybe not at first, but eventually. So next, let's talk about why students plagiarize. Sometimes students plagiarize because it's easier than doing their own writing, especially if it's late at night, last minute, you're too tired to think. Plagiarism starts to sound like a good idea. So clearly if students are plagiarizing, they think they're not going to get caught. Maybe they've gotten away with it before. We can also give students the benefit of the doubt, and I do think it's true that sometimes students honestly don't know any better. No one ever told them what plagiarism was and how to avoid it. And lastly, students might plagiarize out of carelessness. Especially when you're using online sources, it's so easy to cut and paste and accidentally plagiarize. In talking about reasons students plagiarize, the point isn't to give you excuses to tell your teacher, but to figure out how you can avoid getting into these situations. How can you avoid plagiarizing? Don't procrastinate. Start ahead of time. When you give yourself enough time, you can be careful about doing things right. When it's late at night, you're running out of time, the deadline is coming up, that's when plagiarism starts to seem like a good idea. So don't get yourself into that situation. You can also avoid plagiarizing by being careful when you're taking notes. Make sure you're indicating where the information is from. You could write the author and title at the top of the sheet before you start taking notes on that source. Another good habit when taking notes is to put those notes in your own words. Yes, this is harder than just writing down what the book says, but besides helping you to avoid plagiarism, putting notes in your own words also makes it easier for you when you sit down to write your paper later on. Basically, you'll have part of your paper written already. If you're quoting or using the source's exact words, make sure you're putting it in quotation marks. You can even make gigantic quotation marks to make sure you'll remember that this was a quote. And lastly, you want to be very careful when you're cutting and pasting. When we're doing research using the internet and taking notes on our computer simultaneously, it's very easy to cut and paste. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but you do need to be very careful when you're cutting and pasting because it can lead to accidental plagiarism. So, as mentioned previously, when you cut and paste text, make sure you are putting it in quotation marks. You could even use a different color font for quotes if you find that helpful for making sure you don't accidentally plagiarize. In this presentation, we've talked about what plagiarism is, why students do it, how teachers know, and how to avoid it. If you still have questions about plagiarism, ask your instructor or a tutor on your campus. It's always better to ask than to risk getting into trouble. In the next presentation, you'll learn how to use paraphrase to avoid plagiarism. Hi, my name is Robin Tasaka, and I'm an English instructor at UH Maui College. This presentation focuses on using paraphrasing to avoid plagiarism. We'll talk about the steps for paraphrasing, the goals of paraphrasing, and give you a way to practice paraphrasing on your own. Paraphrasing means putting notes into your own words. When you paraphrase, you need to take several steps to make sure you are not plagiarizing. The first step is to read the sentence or passage you want to paraphrase. Read it over and over if you need to, in order to understand what it's saying. Look up definitions for any unfamiliar words. You want to be able to hold the idea of what the sentence is saying in your head, so you need to fully understand it. The next step is to hide the original text. Physically cover it so that you can't look at it, because if you can see it, it's always going to be easier to write it the way the original author wrote it than write it your own way. The third step is to write the sentence in your own words. Don't worry if it's ugly. Don't worry if you're missing bits of info. You can always start back from step 1 again later if you need to, but for now, capture as much of the meaning as you can from memory. Then, when you feel you've captured the idea, check your version against the original to make sure you haven't accidentally plagiarized. Some of you have good memories, so you may have plagiarized by accident. Double check, and if you find any places where your version is too close to the original, or you've inaccurately captured the original idea, address those issues. As you paraphrase, keep in mind these characteristics of an effective paraphrase. An effective paraphrase should accurately capture the original idea. It should also be written in your own words in order to avoid plagiarism. Lastly, an effective paraphrase should sound good. Read it over a few times to see if you like the way it sounds. The best way to practice paraphrasing is to do it. If you are currently working on a research project, identify a passage, maybe a few lines long, that has information you'd like to use in your paper. If you don't have a current research project, try paraphrasing a passage from one of your textbooks or from a newspaper article. Paraphrasing is a great way to make sure you understand what you are reading and remember it more effectively. Practice putting the information in your own words, using the steps provided earlier. I recommend asking your professor or an on-campus tutor to check your paraphrase. If you are working on a research project for a particular class, you might want to ask that professor or a teaching assistant. Sometimes different fields of study have slightly different expectations. You might think you know whether you are plagiarizing or not, but it's best to ask an expert in order to find out for sure and avoid plagiarizing accidentally. In this presentation, we've talked about how to paraphrase in order to avoid plagiarizing. I hope that this presentation will help you to avoid problems with plagiarism in the future.